In order to understand the origins of World War I, we have to discuss the concept of nationalism, and in order to do that, we have to go back into the period of the 1700s known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment took place throughout Western Europe, but it was mainly centered in Great Britain, France, and the German kingdoms. It was a period of high philosophy where people questioned many things and advocated modern ideas of republican and democratic governments to replace the ancient monarchies. The Enlightenment influenced the American and French revolutions, and a little French military commander you may have heard of, Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon tore through Europe like a lightning bolt during the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, he often dismantled the old monarchies of his conquests in favour of new democratic republican-type governments. Of course, Napoleon only did so to create governments that were sympathetic and loyal to him, but his actions planted the first seeds of nationalism. With the monarchies either gone or severely diminished in power, the various European peoples looked for something new to rally around. The answer for many was nationalism. Since there was no single guidebook for nationalism, or no nationalism for dummies, if you will, and nationalism meant different things to different people, its definition can be a bit fluid. Simply put, nationalism is the pride in one's background. In terms of Western Europe in the 19th century and how it influenced the start of World War I, the specific concept of political nationalism is what we need to consider. Political nationalism, as it was thought of and practiced in Europe in the 19th century, was the idea that all people of one nationality should be unified in one nation-state. In other words, all Germans should be in an all-German nation-state, all Italians should be in an all-Italian nation-state, etc. This may seem self-evident today when you consider the modern borders of Europe, but this was not so for most of European history. In the medieval and early modern periods of European history, the continent was divided into kingdoms where the subjects of a king may speak several different languages. For example, the King of England held lands in France into the early modern period. This began to change in the years after the Napoleonic Wars. Europeans began to identify with more their neighbours than their kings, and the idea of creating new nation-states caught steam by the middle of the century. Germany achieved almost total unification on January the 18th in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, and Italy also achieved unification that same year, which they called the Risorgimento. Once the larger European nationalities achieved unification, the smaller nationalities tried to follow in their footsteps. As far as nationalism was concerned, perhaps the biggest elephant in the room before World War I was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a tinderbox waiting to explode and a relic of Europe's medieval past, but it was also a powerful country located in the middle of the continent. As the name of the country implies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or simply Austria and Hungary, was a country that formed in 1867, when the royal families of Austria and Hungary united. At a time when most Western Europeans were moving towards ethnically homogeneous nation-states, the Austro-Hungarian Empire seemingly went in the opposite direction. The elite class of Austria-Hungary was comprised of ethnic Germans, or Austrians, and Magyars, Hungarians, which caused some confusion and consternation among the upper class, but the true problems came from the great mass of the empire's subjects. Most of the subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire were ethnic Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Slovaks, and Czechs. Many Romanians also lived within the confines of the kingdom, as well as a fair amount of Ukrainians, Poles, and Italians. As nationalism took hold of Western Europe in the early and mid-19th century, a very specific Eastern European form known as PanSlavism became popular later in the century. Some Pan-Slavic philosophers believed that all Slavic people should be under one single nation-state, while other, more pragmatic thinkers simply believed that Slavs should have their own countries. The Russian Empire was one of the major proponents of the philosophy, which would play a role in the events leading directly to the start of World War I